Each Sunday this year we're reading from the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew is the longest of the four Gospels, and it contains material that the other synoptics and of course John don't contain. But one of the important things I think for us to remember, and it's particularly relevant in any approach to the parable which forms the Gospel this week, is that Matthew's narrative was written probably some 50 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. So he was harvesting a lot of collective memory. Now, John ends his gospel by saying that Jesus did so many things and there's so much to be told about him that all the books in the world couldn't contain everything. And it is quite obvious from any even superficial analysis of the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that they are a selection. They are an edited version of what resided in the memory of the Christian communities, what had been handed down from one generation to the next and committed to paper or parchment by Matthew in about the year 70 AD. So it is very important to remember that there was a selection process. Why did one parable survive and another perhaps disappear? Why was one story told and treasured and another perhaps not recollected and not included in the Gospels? And that's an important question. There were editors. The memory was filtered. But there's a second very important thing that we should remember, namely that by the year 70 AD, the Jerusalem temple had been destroyed, the Jewish nation had been defeated, the Jews, Jesus' contemporaries, had been dispersed from the promised land, and the church, the group of disciples of Jesus, were now very much surviving on their own, flying on their own wings, strengthened and fortified by the collective memory of the life of Jesus of Nazareth and his teaching, of course, but the Gospels as such became the bedrock of their identity, of their memory, and of their understanding of God's providential love. Now, with all that in mind, you may then say, well, why was this story we heard today, again about the vineyard, about the owner of the vineyard, about this vineyard subcontracted to a group of farmers and harvesters and workers owned by a figure who is clearly supposed to represent God? And the reading from the prophet Isaiah, which began our liturgy of the world today, which was a hymn of love for the land of Israel as God's vineyard, certainly sets the scene very effectively. So the promised land was the vineyard of the Lord himself the vine keeper, and the people of Israel were those responsible for harvesting the grapes as autumn came. And that's a scene with which everybody listening to Jesus in his own day would have been more than familiar. The fact that he returns to the theme so often suggests that it was part and parcel of the life of the Israelites of his time in Galilee, Samaria, or Judea. It didn't matter. And the story, of course, we know is about the owner of the vineyard subcontracting it and from time to time sending his messengers to check up that it was well administered, that the stewards were behaving themselves and doing their work and fulfilling on their commitments. And some of those messengers who came from the owner got very rough treatment indeed. They were either ejected from the vineyard, sometimes fallen upon physically, and in some cases killed. And then the owner decides, look, I'll send my own son. They'll respect him after all, and he will report back to me and look after the harvest. And when the son comes, not only does he get the cold shoulder and rough treatment, but they actually put him to death. So it's a very sad, a very tragic story. But those who were recalling the story at the time that Matthew committed it to the page of his gospel will also have an immediate memory of the recent history of the Jewish people. They will be familiar with the way in which their forefathers treated the prophets. They will have a very good memory indeed of Jesus' crucifixion, of the sufferings he endured in the first Holy Week, and indeed of his initial success and the way he was rejected by his people. But this was the story being read and committed to paper by those who were still his disciples, our forefathers in the faith, the first Christians, who venerated the prophets, who listened to their word, but who also still had an abiding, loving memory of Jesus himself, but also of his sacrificial death. So the parable which Jesus told and which was remembered and committed to paper in Matthew's Gospel is an allegory of Jewish history itself. It is in story form, like a fairy tale, the history of the Jewish people. And I know that Irish history, for example, has frequently been the subject of allegory down the centuries. And what applies to Ireland applies also to this country too, and to many others across the globe, where we mythologize our history, where we only understand its significance through telling the story, through allegory, through fairy tale, through parable. And this is the most striking, most moving, most telling, and in many ways the most tragic parable that fell from the lips of Jesus about the history of his own people, about their rejection of the Messiah. But it does end well, in the sense that the owner of the vineyard, at the death of his son, passed it on to other tenants to look after. And those early Christians recognized themselves as being those tenants. That's why that story was so precious to them. They were the tenants of the new vineyard, and we are their descendants in the faith. The Catholic Church across the world, in every country, is now the vineyard of the God of Israel. We are the stewards. It is up to us to gather in the harvest. And now is the autumn. On the calendar of our year, we're feeling the cold, the days are getting shorter, we're spending more time indoors. But we also know that there is a harvest to our Christian lives as well. Many of you are already gathered in the harvest of your own life. You have children and grandchildren. You have professional lives behind you. You have lives of long devotion to the church behind you, of which you deserve to be proud. But that work still goes on. The world still needs to be evangelized. The new evangelization needs to take wing and bring people to the gospel message who have never heard it. But the most important thing of all is that we look after what has already been achieved. We have discovered during lockdown how much our church as a building, how much our community as a parish means to us. And we must safeguard that, protect it, look after it. And if we do that well, we know that our work, our investment, our prayer, our ongoing celebration of the mysteries of faith will produce an abundant harvest and will contribute not only to our salvation, but to the salvation of a countless number of souls.